What if I told you that everything you think you know about William Wallace's death is wrong? That the Hollywood version you've seen 1,000 times barely scratches the surface of what actually happened on that August morning in 1305? What if I told you that the real execution was so horrifically brutal, so systematically designed to break not just a man, but the spirit of an entire nation, that even hardened medieval witnesses were left traumatized? And what if I told you that this execution, meant to end Scottish resistance forever, actually did the complete opposite and sparked a revolution that would echo through centuries? Because that's exactly what happened, and the truth is far more shocking than any movie could ever portray. You see, when most people think of William Wallace, they picture Mel Gibson in blue face paint screaming about freedom. But the real William Wallace was something far more dangerous to the English crown than any Hollywood hero. He was a symbol that refused to die, even when they literally tore his body apart, piece by piece, in front of thousands of cheering spectators. And today, we're going to dive deep into the most brutal execution in medieval history. One so calculated and cruel that it backfired spectacularly and changed the course of history forever. But before we get to that horrifying August morning, we need to understand exactly how we got here. Because this wasn't just an execution. This was the climax of a political thriller that had been building for years. Picture this. It's the late 13th century, and Scotland is hanging by a thread. The country is caught in a brutal succession crisis that's tearing the kingdom apart from the inside. Noble families are at each other's throats, each claiming the right to the throne, and the entire nation is bleeding itself dry in civil war. Enter Edward I of England, known as Longshanks.
Thanks, and this is where our story really begins to get dark. Edward wasn't just any medieval king. This was a man who had already crushed Welsh resistance with such brutal efficiency that Welsh independence was nothing but a memory. He'd expelled every single Jew from England in a campaign of ethnic cleansing that shocked even medieval Europe. This was a king who understood power in its most raw, terrifying form, and he looked at Scotland's chaos and saw opportunity. Edward's plan was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. He would position himself as the arbiter of Scotland's succession crisis, play the different claimants against each other, and when the dust settled, Scotland would find itself under direct English control, not as a conquered territory, but as a willing vassal state that had invited English rule. It was political manipulation at its most sophisticated, and it was working perfectly. But then, something happened that Edward never saw coming. A minor Scottish landowner, someone who should have been completely irrelevant in the grand scheme of medieval politics, decided he'd had enough. William Wallace wasn't born to be a revolutionary leader. He wasn't from one of the great noble families that usually shaped Scottish politics. He was just a man who had watched his family suffer under English occupation, who had seen his countrymen humiliated and brutalized, and who had reached that breaking point where dying for a cause becomes preferable to living under oppression.
And here's where the story gets absolutely wild, because what Wallace did next was militarily impossible. In September 1297, at a place called Stirling Bridge, Wallace and his co-commander, Andrew Moray, did something that every military expert said couldn't be done. They defeated English heavy cavalry with an army of peasants and foot soldiers. The English army that rode onto that battlefield was the most professional, well-equipped military force in Europe. These were knights who had conquered Wales, who had crushed rebellions across the continent, who represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval warfare. But Wallace had studied that army, had understood its weaknesses, and had chosen his battlefield with the precision of a master strategist. As the English cavalry charged across that narrow bridge, confident in their inevitable victory, Wallace's schiltrons of spearmen closed like a trap. What followed was a massacre that sent shockwaves across medieval Europe. The cream of English nobility died in Scottish mud, and suddenly, the impossible seemed possible. Scottish independence wasn't just a dream anymore, it was a reality being written in English blood. The psychological impact of Stirling Bridge cannot be overstated. For the first time in decades, Scots could look at English power and see it bleed. Wallace had proven that the English war machine wasn't invincible, that careful planning and fierce determination could overcome superior numbers and equipment. Word of the victory spread like wildfire across Scotland, and suddenly, peasants and nobles alike were rallying to Wallace's banner. The rebellion that Edward thought he had strangled in its cradle was now burning across the entire kingdom. But Edward Longshanks wasn't called the Hammer of the Scots for nothing. This was a king who understood that rebellions were like fires. if you didn't extinguish them, Compline.
Italy, they would spread until they consumed everything. Edward's response to Stirling Bridge was swift and absolutely merciless. He assembled the largest army that had ever marched north from England, a force so massive and well-equipped that contemporary chroniclers struggled to find words to describe it. The confrontation came at Falkirk in 1298, and this time Edward wasn't taking any chances. He had learned from Stirling Bridge, had adapted his tactics, and when the two armies met, the result was everything that Stirling Bridge hadn't been. Wallace's army was annihilated. His noble allies abandoned him en masse, fleeing back to their castles to make peace with Edward before the English king's wrath could fall on them. In a single afternoon, the Scottish resistance went from triumph to catastrophe. But here's what made Wallace truly dangerous to English power. He refused to accept defeat. Most medieval leaders faced with the kind of crushing loss that happened at Falkirk would have sued for peace, accepted whatever terms they could get, and tried to salvage what remained of their power. Wallace did the exact opposite. He disappeared into the Scottish wilderness and began a guerrilla campaign that would make Edward's life a living hell for the next 7 years. This wasn't the kind of warfare that medieval armies were designed to handle. Wallace's forces struck at supply lines, ambushed isolated garrisons, and melted away into the countryside before English forces could respond. They turned the Scottish landscape itself into a weapon, using their knowledge of every hill, forest, and bog to stay one step ahead of the massive English armies that were hunting them. Edward found himself pouring enormous resources into a campaign that seemed to have no end, fighting an enemy who refused to stand still long enough to be crushed. But perhaps most importantly, Wallace had become something more dangerous than just a military leader. He had become a symbol. Even when his armies were defeated, even when his allies abandoned him, the idea of William Wallace continued to inspire resistance across Scotland. Edward understood this threat better than anyone, because he had seen how symbols could be more powerful than armies. The very existence of William Wallace as a free man was a constant reminder that English rule in Scotland was not absolute, that resistance was possible. Which brings us to why what happened next was so crucial to Edward's plans. By 1305, most of the Scottish nobility had submitted to English rule. The great castles had fallen, the major towns were under English control, and organized resistance had collapsed. Scotland seemed pacified, but Edward knew that as long as William Wallace remained free, the rebellion could reignite at any moment. Wallace had to be captured, and more importantly, he had to be made an example of, in a way that would terrify anyone who might consider following in his footsteps. The manhunt for Wallace became one of the most extensive and expensive operations of Edward's reign. English agents and Scottish collaborators scoured the countryside, following every lead, chasing every rumor. A massive bounty was placed on Wallace's head, enough money to make any man wealthy for life. The English administration in Scotland worked systematically to cut off Wallace's support network, arresting suspected sympathizers, confiscating lands, and making it clear that helping Wallace meant signing your own death warrant. For years, Wallace managed to stay ahead of his hunters, but the net was closing. His support network was being systematically destroyed, his safe houses were being compromised, and the number of people willing to risk everything to help him was dwindling. The psychological pressure must have been enormous, knowing that any day could be your last, that any face you encountered might belong to someone who had decided that your life was worth less than English gold. The end came in August 1305, near Glasgow, and it came through betrayal in the most personal possible way. Sir John Menteith, someone Wallace had trusted, someone who had been part of the Scottish resistance, made the calculation that his own survival was more important than loyalty to the cause. The details of the capture remain murky. Some sources suggest that Wallace was betrayed during what he thought was a clandestine meeting with allies. Others that he was simply overwhelmed by English forces who had been tipped off to his location. But regardless of the specifics, the moment of capture marked the beginning of the end of one of the most remarkable lives in medieval history. Wallace, who had defied the most powerful king in Europe for nearly a decade, who had proven that Scottish independence was possible, was now in chains and on his way to London to face whatever revenge Edward Longshanks had been planning all these years. The journey to London was itself a form of torture, a carefully orchestrated humiliation designed to break Wallace's spirit before he even reached his trial. He was paraded through English towns like a prize of war, displayed to crowds who had been told he was a monster, a murderer, a traitor to the rightful king. At every stop, local officials would read out his supposed crimes, painting him as everything from a savage barbarian to a heretical blasphemer. But those who witnessed Wallace during this journey would later remark on something that clearly frustrated his captors. His bearing never changed. Despite the chains, despite the humiliation, despite knowing exactly what awaited him in London, Wallace maintained a dignity that seemed to unnerve even his guards. He wasn't broken, wasn't begging for mercy, wasn't giving his captors the satisfaction of seeing him reduced to the level of a common criminal. When the procession finally reached London in late August 1305, the city was buzzing with anticipation. Word had spread that the great enemy of England, the man who had defied Edward Longshanks for nearly a decade, was finally going to face justice. But this wasn't going to be just any execution. Edward had been planning something special, something that would serve as the ultimate deterrent to anyone who might consider following Wallace's example. The trial was set for August 23, 1305 in Westminster Hall, and from the moment it began, it was clear that this was theater, not justice. The charges read against Wallace were extensive and damning. Treason against King Edward, murder of English subjects, sacrilege against holy places, arson and destruction of property, and a litany of other crimes that painted him as the worst kind of medieval criminal. But here's where the entire proceeding revealed its true nature as political theater rather than legal process. Wallace's response to the charges was simple and devastating. He could not be guilty of treason against Edward because he had never acknowledged Edward as his king. It was a legal argument that was both technically correct and politically impossible for an English court to accept. Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward, had never been Edward's subject, and therefore could not be a traitor in any meaningful legal sense. The proceedings were conducted in Latin, which Wallace almost certainly didn't understand, adding another layer of cruel absurdity to the entire spectacle. He was being tried for crimes defined by laws he couldn't read, in a language he couldn't speak, by judges who had already decided his fate before he ever entered the courtroom. Every aspect of the trial was designed to legitimize a predetermined outcome while maintaining the facade of English legal authority. The sentence, when it came, was exactly what Edward had planned from the moment Wallace was captured. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most severe punishment available under English law, reserved for traitors, and designed not just to kill, but to completely destroy both body and soul. Each element of the execution had specific symbolic meaning. The drawing represented degradation and humiliation. The hanging showed rejection by heaven itself. The disemboweling symbolized spiritual corruption being purged from the body, and the quartering represented the complete destruction of the person. But even knowing what was coming, even understanding that he was facing the most horrific death that medieval justice could devise, Wallace's demeanor reportedly never changed. Contemporary witnesses described a man who seemed almost detached from the proceedings, as if he had already moved beyond fear and was simply waiting for the inevitable. August 23, 1305, dawned clear and warm in London, and the city had transformed itself into a carnival of anticipated violence. This wasn't just another execution. This was the main event, the climax of nearly a decade of war between England and Scotland, and people had traveled from across the kingdom to witness it. Scaffolds had been erected at Smithfield, the traditional site for the most important executions, and vendors were already setting up to sell food and drink to the crowds. The atmosphere was festive in the most disturbing possible way. Families brought children to watch, nobles reserved the best viewing positions, and there was a genuine sense of celebration in the air. This was entertainment in medieval England, a reminder of the power of the crown and the fate that awaited anyone who dared to challenge royal authority. The execution began with the drawing, and this is where the reality of what Wallace faced becomes truly horrific. He was stripped naked and tied to a hurdle, essentially a wooden frame that would be dragged through the streets behind horses. The route had been carefully planned to take him through the busiest districts of London, ensuring maximum spectacle and humiliation. As the horses began to move, Wallace's body was dragged across cobblestones that quickly began tearing his flesh. The crowds that lined the route jeered and threw refuse, but contemporary accounts suggest that something unexpected was happening. Instead of the broken, begging wretch that spectators expected to see, Wallace maintained a dignity that seemed to unnerve even his tormentors. His eyes were described as fixed on some distant point, and despite the physical agony he was enduring, he never cried out. The trail of blood that marked Wallace's passage through London was intended to be a symbol of English justice, but it was becoming something else entirely, a testament to human endurance that was making even hardened medieval spectators uncomfortable. This wasn't going according to Edward's plan. Wallace was supposed to be broken, humiliated, reduced to begging for mercy. Instead, he was becoming something more dangerous to English authority, a martyr in the making. When the procession reached Smithfield, an even larger crowd had gathered. The execution ground had been transformed into an amphitheater of cruelty, with tiered seating for nobles and officials, vendors selling refreshments, and a carnival atmosphere that modern minds can barely comprehend. This was state-sponsored entertainment, a public holiday dedicated to watching a human being destroyed piece by piece. The hanging came next, but this wasn't the quick, merciful death by broken neck that we might imagine. Wallace was positioned so that the rope would strangle him slowly, cutting off his air but not breaking his neck. The goal was to bring him to the very edge of death without actually killing him, because the real show was yet to come. As consciousness began to fade, as his vision darkened and his lungs screamed for air, Wallace was cut down and revived. What happened next was the most horrific phase of the entire execution, something so brutal that even medieval chroniclers struggled to find words to describe it. While Wallace was still conscious, still aware of what was happening to him, the executioner cut open his abdomen and began systematically removing his organs. One by one, his intestines were pulled from his body and held up for the crowd to see before being thrown into a fire that had been prepared for this specific purpose. The symbolism was deliberate and terrifying. In medieval thought, the bowels were considered the seat of emotion and compassion. By burning Wallace's organs while he watched, Edward was making a statement about what happened to those emotions when directed against English authority. But the psychological impact on the crowd was unexpected. Instead of the cheers and jeers that had marked the earlier phases of the execution, witnesses reported screams from spectators who couldn't bear to watch what was happening.
Throughout this systematic destruction of his body, Wallace maintained consciousness. Contemporary accounts describe his eyes as remaining open and aware, fixed on something beyond the crowd, beyond the pain, beyond the horror of what was being done to him. It was a display of human endurance that was supposed to break the spirit of Scottish resistance, but was instead creating something far more dangerous, a symbol of unbreakable will. The beheading, when it finally came, was almost an act of mercy. A single stroke of a sharp axe ended Wallace's suffering and brought to a close one of the most remarkable lives in medieval history. But even in death, Edward wasn't finished with him. Wallace's body was cut into 4 parts, each piece held up for the crowd to inspect, each one destined for a different corner of Edward's territories. Wallace's head was dipped in tar and mounted on a spike at London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a warning to anyone entering the city. His body parts were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, major towns in both England and Scotland, where they would serve as constant reminders of what happened to those who defied English rule. Each piece was a message, a symbol of English power projected into communities that might be considering resistance. Edward's plan seemed perfect in its cruelty and thoroughness. Wallace was dead, his body literally scattered to the 4 winds, and the manner of his death had been so horrific that surely no one would ever again consider the cost of rebellion worth paying. The great enemy of England had been not just defeated, but completely destroyed, transformed from a symbol of resistance into a warning against defying royal authority. But here's where Edward Longshanks made one of the greatest miscalculations in political history. Instead of crushing Scottish resistance, Wallace's execution had the exact opposite effect. The brutality of his death, witnessed by thousands and described in horrified detail across Europe, didn't create fear. It created outrage. The manner of Wallace's dying became more powerful than anything he had accomplished in life. Within months of the execution, Scottish resistance was stronger than it had been in years. Robert the Bruce, who had been wavering between submission and rebellion, was inspired by the spectacle of Wallace's death to take up arms against English rule. The nobility, who had submitted to Edward, began quietly supporting the new rebellion.
Even common people, who had seemed resigned to English occupation, found themselves stirred by stories of Wallace's courage in his final moments. The execution had created something that Edward never anticipated: a martyr whose suffering gave meaning to the cause of Scottish independence. Wallace's refusal to break, his dignity in the face of unimaginable cruelty, had transformed him from a defeated rebel into something approaching a saint in the minds of his countrymen. The very brutality that was supposed to deter resistance had instead sanctified it. But the impact went far beyond Scotland's borders. European courts, already suspicious of Edward's ambitions, watched the execution with horror and disgust. The systematic cruelty of Wallace's death was seen as excessive even by medieval standards, and it contributed to England's growing isolation in European politics. Edward had intended to send a message about English power, but the message that was received was about English barbarism. The tactical implications were equally significant. Scottish resistance fighters understood that capture now meant not just death, but torture so severe that death would come as a relief. This knowledge transformed the nature of the conflict, creating a no-quarter culture where fighters on beat them up. Other sides knew that surrender was not an option. The brutality of Wallace's execution had escalated the war to a level of savagery that would characterize Anglo-Scottish conflicts for generations. The historical documentation of Wallace's execution reveals just how carefully planned and significant the English authorities considered the event to be. The Lanercost Chronicle, written by English monks, provides clinical details of every phase of the execution, describing not just what was done to Wallace, but the reaction of the crowd. Scottish sources like the Chronicle of John of Fordun present Wallace as a dignified martyr who maintained his composure throughout his ordeal. Legal records preserved in the English National Archives document everything from the specific charges brought against Wallace to the detailed instructions for the disposal of his remains. This wasn't a spontaneous act of royal rage. It was a carefully orchestrated political statement that Edward's administration understood would have consequences far beyond the death of one man. Multiple witness accounts survive from both English and Scottish observers, and they reveal something remarkable about how different audiences interpreted the same events. English sources tend to focus on the justice of Wallace's punishment and the proper application of legal procedures. Scottish sources emphasize Wallace's courage and dignity, transforming the execution from a demonstration of English power into proof of Scottish moral superiority. The long-term legacy of Wallace's execution extends far beyond medieval Scotland. It became a foundational myth of Scottish nationalism, a story that gave meaning to centuries of struggle for independence. But more than that, it became a symbol of how brutality can backfire, how attempting to crush the human spirit through violence can instead strengthen it. The execution contributed to the development of concepts that would eventually become central to international law and human rights. The idea that even enemies deserve basic human dignity, that there are limits to what can be done even to those who oppose legitimate authority, can be traced back to reactions to events like Wallace's execution. Medieval observers who watched the systematic destruction of a human being were forced to confront questions about the nature of justice and the limits of power. Wallace's story has been retold countless times in literature, art, and film, with each generation finding new meaning in his struggle. The basic narrative, the small man standing against overwhelming power, maintaining dignity in the face of cruelty, inspiring others through sacrifice, has become a universal symbol of resistance to oppression. But perhaps most importantly, Wallace's execution serves as a reminder of the unpredictable nature of political symbolism. Edward intended to create a symbol of English power and the futility of resistance. Instead, he created a symbol of Scottish endurance and the possibility of freedom. The very brutality that was meant to demonstrate the hopelessness of opposing English rule became proof that some principles are worth any price. The execution also reveals something disturbing about human nature and the dynamics of power. The thousands of spectators who gathered to watch Wallace die, who cheered his suffering and bought refreshments from vendors, represent the dark potential that exists in any society. The normalization of cruelty, the transformation of human destruction into entertainment, shows how quickly civilized behavior can collapse when it serves the interests of power. Yet at the same time, the documented discomfort of some spectators, the horror expressed by chroniclers, and the eventual transformation of Wallace from victim to hero shows that human conscience cannot be completely suppressed.
Even in the most brutal circumstances, some part of the human spirit recognizes dignity and responds to courage. The story of William Wallace's execution is ultimately a story about the power of symbols and the unpredictability of how they function. Edward Longshanks, one of the most successful monarchs in English history, made a fundamental miscalculation about how power works. He believed that the systematic application of violence could control not just actions, but thoughts, that sufficient brutality could crush not just bodies, but spirits. Wallace's response to his ordeal proved that assumption wrong. By maintaining his dignity in the face of unimaginable cruelty, by refusing to be broken even as his body was literally torn apart, Wallace demonstrated that there are aspects of human experience that power cannot touch. His execution was meant to end Scottish dreams of independence, but instead, it provided those dreams with their most powerful symbol. The ripple effects of that August morning in 1305 continued for centuries. Robert the Bruce, inspired by Wallace's example, would go on to secure Scottish independence at Bannockburn. The memory of Wallace's sacrifice would inspire Scottish resistance through centuries of English attempts at domination. Even today, more than 700 years later, Wallace remains a symbol of Scottish identity and the struggle for freedom. But the lesson of Wallace's execution extends far beyond Scotland or the medieval period. It serves as a reminder that the human spirit, when tested to its absolute limits, can choose dignity over survival, principle over comfort, meaning over safety. Wallace's story suggests that there are values worth dying for, that some prices are worth paying, regardless of the cost. The execution also demonstrates the complex relationship between violence and political power. Edward's attempt to use spectacular cruelty as a tool of control backfired because it revealed the moral bankruptcy of his position. The very extremity of Wallace's punishment made clear that English rule in Scotland depended not on justice or legitimate authority, but on naked force and intimidation. In the end, William Wallace's execution became one of the great miscalculations of medieval politics. Edward Longshanks, seeking to create a symbol of English power, instead created a symbol of its limits. The brutality that was meant to demonstrate the futility of resistance became proof that resistance was not only possible, but necessary. The man who was supposed to die as a warning became a martyr whose memory would inspire centuries of struggle for freedom. The true horror of Wallace's execution lies not just in its physical brutality, but in its failure to achieve its political goals. Edward sacrificed his moral authority, damaged England's international reputation, and provided his enemies with their most powerful propaganda tool, all in pursuit of a demonstration of power that ultimately demonstrated its opposite. The execution that was meant to end Scottish resistance instead gave it a meaning and a power that no military victory could have provided. Wallace's final gift to the cause of Scottish independence was not his life, but his death, not the manner of his dying, but the dignity with which he faced it. In choosing to die rather than submit, in maintaining his humanity even as his body was destroyed, Wallace proved that there are victories that transcend military success, that the greatest triumphs are sometimes moral rather than material. Today, more than 7 centuries after that horrific August morning at Smithfield, William Wallace's execution continues to resonate because it touches on fundamental questions about human nature, political power, and the price of freedom. It reminds us that liberty is not free, that it has always been purchased with the blood and suffering of those willing to pay it its price. But it also reminds us that the human spirit, when tested to its limits, can choose dignity over survival and principle over safety. The story of William Wallace's execution is ultimately a story about the unpredictable nature of power and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Edward Longshanks thought he was ending a rebellion, but instead, he was beginning a legend. He thought he was demonstrating the futility of resistance, but instead, he was proving its necessity. Most importantly, he thought he was destroying a man, but instead, he was creating a symbol that would outlive empires. Wallace's execution stands as perhaps the greatest example in history of how violence, when taken to its logical extreme, can defeat itself. The brutality that was meant to terrify became an inspiration. The cruelty that was designed to deter became a rallying cry, and the death that was intended to end a cause instead gave it eternal life. In trying to make William Wallace an example of English power, Edward Longshanks instead made him an eternal symbol of why that power deserved to be resisted.
And that, perhaps, is the most horrifying truth about William Wallace's execution. Not just what was done to him, but how completely it backfired on those who did it. Edward sought to create fear and found himself facing fury. He intended to demonstrate strength and instead revealed weakness. He tried to end Scottish dreams of independence and instead gave those dreams their most powerful symbol. The execution that was meant to solve England's Scottish problem instead ensured that it would continue for centuries to come. This is why William Wallace's execution remains one of the most significant events in medieval history. Not because of its brutality, though that was extreme even by the standards of the age, but because of its consequences. A single morning's work at Smithfield changed the course of history, transforming a defeated rebel into an eternal symbol of resistance and turning what should have been England's moment of triumph into the beginning of its greatest failure in Scotland. The legacy of that August morning continues to this day, a reminder that some things cannot be conquered by force, that the human spirit has resources that power cannot touch, and that the greatest victories are sometimes won not by those who survive, but by those who choose how they die. William Wallace's execution was far more horrifying than we imagine, not just because of what was done to his body, but because of what it revealed about the limits of power and the enduring strength of human dignity in the face of unspeakable cruelty.